This reading is The Anatomy of Fascism. Our speaker is Yunus Bakhsh, who barely needs an introduction, but he's been a working class fighter. He's fought for his union, against his union. He's had personal experience of being targeted by the fascists in the BNP. And now, Yunus.
It's a bit ironic, really. We're having this meeting in anatomy because, of course, as any good surgeon would tell you, if you need to understand how to deal with a disease, to cure a disease, you need to know what it is and where it comes from to start with. And fascism really is such a disease. It's something that we have to know what it is in order to really deal with it effectively, because it is a deadly disease. It's something which every time ends in death, and so therefore it's absolutely vital that we have an understanding about it. And fascism itself was officially born, what we understand to be fascism. The first fascist party was officially formed on the 23rd of March, on a Sunday the 23rd of March 1919, and it was formed in a room in the Milan Industrial and Commercial Alliance Centre. And it made a declaration. Its declaration was this: we declare war against socialism because it has opposed nationalism. That was the first founding declaration of the Italian Fascist Party. And the word fascism, of course, derives from the Italian word for bundle, from the fasci, which was a bundle of sticks in which there was an axe in the centre, and that was seen as and was the symbol of authority in ancient Rome, and that's where the fascists drew their name from, that they were to be an axe, an organisation of authority. And I want to look really at the roots of Italian fascism to start with, and where it came from. You see, Italy at the turn of the 20th century was a society which was, or a state which was very much divided into two parts. In the north, you had a heavily industrial, very modern society with a very significant and combative working class. In the south of Italy, you had a very underdeveloped region where there was still effectively semi-feudal relations of production. And it was a society in which there were huge levels of conflict. For example, in the June 1914, just before the outbreak of the First World War, there was a virtual insurrectionary general strike breakout. A general strike which saw hundreds of people dead. I mean, I'm sure most people here were out on Thursday, on the 30th. I doubt very much, and I've not read any reports yet, that the police opened fire on any demonstrations. They did in Italy in 1914. And a man called Benito Mussolini was a member of the Italian Socialist Party, and he was on the extreme left of that organisation. And he regarded himself as a revolutionary socialist. He said he drew his inspiration from, amongst others, Karl Marx. And this is what he had to say about the onset or the likelihood of war in Italy, which would drag Italy into it. He said, the national flag is for us a rag to plant on a dunghill. Now that's Benito Mussolini, who would become later on the Duce, the dictator, the fascist dictator of Italy. And he became the editor of the Socialist Party's newspaper, Avanti. And however, as war broke out, and it wasn't just Mussolini incidentally, but all these socialist parties throughout Europe, all these social democratic parties which had pledged their opposition to the war, as a war which would be worker against worker, we're internationalists, we cannot support the war, began to flip. One by one, they fell in line with their own ruling class and came down on the side of the war. The Italian Socialist Party actually was one of the exceptions. It didn't do that. But Mussolini, as the editor of the paper, went over to the other side, and he produced an editorial in which basically he said, and on October the 18th, without informing his colleagues, Mussolini published an article which had the title "From Absolute to Active and Working Neutrality," in which he claimed that the war had to be an anti-German, an anti-Austrian war, and absolute neutrality, he argued, meant coming down on the side of the war. And for that, he was effectively expelled from the Socialist Party. He set up his own paper called Il Popolo d'Italia, and my apologies to anybody, I suffer unfortunately from the British disease of education. And therefore my command of languages isn't particularly great, but he set up his own newspaper, which was heavily financed by sections of the Italian arms industry, and he began to agitate around the issue of the war and in support of the war in amongst the nationalist fervour which began to develop in Italy. Now, war for Italy went not particularly well, actually. I mean, they didn't succeed in their gains in terms of growing, expanding Italian capital interest, etc. And Italy, like just about every other country in Europe, at the end of the First World War, was engulfed by the revolutionary wave, which of course reached its pinnacle with the victory of the Bolsheviks in Russia, but which swept right across the whole of mainland Europe. And it affected Italy hugely. There was a massive move to the left. And I want to give you really a flavour of how far that pushed Italian society and politics to the left. Because in the 1919 elections, which were held in Italy, the Italian Socialist Party, and bearing in mind the Italian Socialist Party is the equivalent of the British Labour Party, it went into those elections with a manifesto which stated this: the proletariat must be incited to the violent seizure of political and economic power, and this must be handed over entirely and exclusively to the workers' and peasants' councils. Its slogan in the election was "all power to the proletariat united in its councils." Quite a distance, obviously, from Ed Miliband and the British Labour Party. But you can get a sense, therefore, of how far the whole of society had shifted to the left. How revolution, the prospect of socialist revolution, was on the agenda to the extent that even the Italian Socialist Party, a party which had an extreme left wing, a revolutionary wing, and a right wing, was nevertheless prepared to put that forward as its manifesto. And they did exceptionally well. Their vote tripled in that election. And it was the left who began to benefit from the crisis of Italian society at the end of the First World War. The fascists, which had already been, as I say, established, did particularly badly. Mussolini stood in Milan and he got only 5,000 votes out of nearly 300,000. The fascists were a marginal force in a situation where the whole of Italian society was virtually on the verge of revolution. And in August, the revolutionary wave hit the factories of the north, in particular around Turin and Milan. There were strikes which then moved from the defensive strikes to offensive occupation of the factories. And in a period of less than a month, there were 280 factories occupied in Milan, 200 factories occupied in Turin. There were workers' committees set up. The factories were defended by armed workers' militias called the Red Guards. Italy, apparently, or seemingly, was on the verge of a revolution just like the one that had taken place in Russia. Now, I haven't really got time to go into how and why that revolution or that revolutionary moment, that possibility, never came about. Needless to say, I have to say that whereas in Russia, the party which espoused the slogans I've just mentioned about all power to the Soviets actually meant it, the Italian Socialist Party leadership did not. And consequently the opportunity was lost. and the factory occupations were defeated. But it didn't mean, of course, that the Italian working class suddenly thought that it was destroyed, all hope was gone. The vote of the Socialist Party continued to rise, and the left continued to remain a serious problem for the Italian ruling class. But it was at the point when workers had actually missed the opportunity to take state power that the fascists began to make their move. I already mentioned that the Mussolini and his group had received funding from various armaments manufacturers and so on. Sections of the ruling class began to see a real prospect, obviously, of revolution, and therefore looked to a means to destroy the Red Danger, as they saw it. And they began increasingly to look towards the fascists because they lost faith in the existing bourgeois parties as a means of dealing with the militant revolutionary Italian working class. Now, the fascists, when they had been formed, comprised of a mishmash of various groups. Most significant were ex-soldiers, people were called arditi. These were mostly officers who had felt they'd been betrayed in the war, they felt at a loss to know what to do, they felt they hadn't been rewarded for their efforts in the war, and they were obviously attracted very much to nationalist ideas. The Italian fascists also appealed to students, and students not in the sense that we understand students today, who, the majority of students in Britain come from the working class. Students then, and being a student was quite a privileged position, and many of the students were the sons, and I say the sons, of the bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie, who looked for adventure, looked for something to give their lives meaning. The fascist movement attracted to it the dregs of society, criminals, petty criminals, gangsters, etc. What united the fascist movement, the people who were drawn around it, was nationalism, was an extreme hatred of the left. I've already mentioned that their founding slogan was "Death to Socialism." And Mussolini began to pull around him this organisation, effectively what we would call a petty bourgeois organisation, predominantly lower middle class, not funded by the ruling class or sections of them, but nevertheless the mass of the membership were composed of the petty bourgeoisie. Now, the ideology of fascism was as I say, a bizarre mixture of a number of things. I mean, they adopted a programme with a whole series of demands. A progressive tax on capital of 85% on war profits, universal franchise for men and women, a national militia, a minimum wage, nationalisation of the munitions industries, workers' participation in the management of industrial enterprises, the confiscation of all ecclesiastical property. Those were radical demands, as you can see, combined with a demand for of an Italy on the Alps and the Adriatic Sea, with the annexation of Friuli and Dalmatia, and a demand for the expansion of Italian capital. So they combined sort of pseudo-left-wing, in fact not pseudo-left-wing, actually left-wing demands with nationalistic demands. And there's a purpose to that, because quite clearly, if you are to build a mass movement, and this is, as you'll see, this is common to fascism. If you're to build a mass movement comprising of people who aren't completely stupid, I mean many of them are stupid, clearly, but many of them aren't stupid, who look at the system, you can't simply say, we're an organisation which stands for the rich, and always will do, and we despise you, you're shit, we want to crap on you, come and join us. Now, that's not really going to have much of an appeal, to be quite honest, but that's why the fascists combined the two sets of ideas, contradictory ideas, but nevertheless able to appeal to a significant section of the Italian society. The organisation of the fascists they didn't really have a set of ideas. I mean, actually, after Mussolini came to power, they tried to organise a conference where they tried to come up with an ideology for fascism. They had to stop the meeting because all the professors and the people who were coming forward with ideas were denouncing fascism and coming out in favour of Marxism. So they shut it down and arrested most of the people who were at the conference. The fascists organised something particular. They started to organise the ex-soldiers and their supporters into squads, squadristic, into groups who would be used as combat troops against the working class and against their opponents. And they started, as I say, they didn't attack, incidentally, the factory occupations, even though they existed at the time. It was after the factory occupations had been defeated and broken up that the fascists started to attack sections of the trade union and workers and the peasants' organisations. And incidentally, as they started to do it, the police and the army did absolutely nothing. Indeed, it says here, on October the 20th, Bonomi, the Minister of War, drafted a circular. Officers who were being demobilised and joined the fascist combat armies, were to receive 4/5 of their pay. In other words, actually the state actively encouraged people who were moving out of the army to join the fascists and paid them to do so. And what then happened was that the fascists unleashed, as they promised to, a war on the left. And throughout 1921-1922, there were a whole series of attacks on workers' organisations. I'll give you a flavour of this, of how far it went. During the first 6 months of 1921, the fascists destroyed 85 agrarian cooperatives, 59 chambers of labour, 43 unions of agricultural workers, 25 people's centres, and many left-wing printing presses and newspapers. In other words, they went for it on a big scale. These squads attacked any workers' organisations. I'll come on to it later about the role of the English Defence League, but I mean, you can imagine what it must be like, what it must have been like in a situation where armed bands of fascists, several thousand strong, supported by the police, or at least with the police and the army turning a blind eye, attack a union meeting, attack your political meeting, attack all the cooperatives and the people's centres and so on. That was the level of violence that was unleashed by Mussolini to demonstrate that he was serious to his backers and his supporters, that a fascist movement was serious in its intent to destroy the workers' movements. Now, belatedly, in August 1922, the Italian Socialist Party called a general strike. And I say it was belatedly because they'd done very little indeed to combat the growth of the fascists directly. It was too late. The strike was broken by the fascists, and effectively the fascists then at that stage were on the verge of taking power. And in October 1922, the heads of the General Confederation of Industry, the Confederation of Agriculture and the Bankers Association wrote to the King and demanded that Mussolini be made the Prime Minister. And that's indeed what happened. Now, again, there's a lot of myths around how the fascists came to power. The myth about the March on Rome, the idea that these hordes of fascists marched on Rome and effectively carried out a revolutionary seizure of power. It's absolute bollocks. Total bollocks. For example, Mussolini's plan was that he was going to ride in on a white horse. Actually fell off his horse twice. Like all good petty bourgeois, he got the train into Rome and took power from there. And of course, once the fascists were in power, all those radical slogans went out the window. Absolutely went out the window. There was a wave of terror unleashed against the opponents. Political parties were banned, not immediately, but eventually all political parties were banned. Strikes were banned, workers' organisations were destroyed, and so on. And between 1922 and 1945, when Mussolini was shot by the partisans and hung by his ankles in the Piazza Loreto, he oversaw a 25% reduction in the standard of living for ordinary working people. He did his job for the Italian ruling class. Unfortunately for him, the Italian ruling class did their job on him. Now, if that was Italian fascism, then what we saw in Germany made it pale into insignificance. It's not to downplay the horror and the terror, that's why I went through what the fascists did. But what we saw in Germany was fascism in its raw state, in a state which I tell you, if it ever came to power anywhere in an advanced Western society, that's what it would look like. And in Germany, the triumph of fascism was more extreme than Italy for a number of reasons. One, because the extent of the crisis in Germany was far deeper. Two, because the German working class it had to confront and destroy was far stronger and far more rooted in German society. And I would also add something else, something which has been missing so far, you might have noticed from my description of Italian fascism, and that is at the core of German fascism was anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish racism, which didn't exist. I mean, I'm not saying Mussolini wasn't a racist, he wasn't somebody who didn't regard Italian people as superior, and so on, but there was nothing like the level of anti-Semitism that existed in the Nazis. Now, quickly, Germany again was a society after the First World War, which was again engulfed by the revolutionary wave. In 1918, the German Navy mutinied at Kiel. The whole of Germany was covered by workers' and soldiers' councils. The entire country was on the verge of workers' revolution. Unfortunately, the leading organisation in the German working class, the Social Democratic Party, saw that prospect as a threat. And in order to destroy it, the German Social Democratic Party unleashed an organisation called a Freikorps on the German workers' councils. Again, these were ex-soldiers, mostly officers, nationalistic, many of them anti-Semitic. I mean, the first time the swastika ever appeared was to appear on the helmets of the Freikorps. They were used to smash the workers' councils. They went from town to town, from city to city, destroying workers' organisations in armed battles with them. They were the ones who murdered Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Berlin in 1919. Now, the whole of German society, as I say, was convulsed between 1918 and 1923 in a virtual civil war situation. In 1920, there was an attempt by the far right to have a putsch, a military coup led by an obscure civil servant called Kapp. That was put down by a general strike organised by the trade unions and the left. In March 1921, the German Communist Party, by this time 400,000 strong, organised an ultra-left attempt to take power called the March Actions, which came to naught. And in 1923, in the middle of the crisis, of a crisis which, I'll give you some figures here. German society was gripped by an economic crisis which saw inflation, right? What's inflation today in Britain? 10%? 5%? I can't do that. I'll leave that to whoever writes do the meetings on the economy. In Germany, the dollar, on the 23rd of November, on the 13th of November 1923, the dollar was quoted, and it had moved from being, it was quoted as 840 billion marks to the dollar. 840, and it peaked at 4,200 billion to the dollar. Can you imagine what that would do to your savings? People, I mean, you see, let's wipe out a second. I mean, people see the old film newsreel of people taking their wages home in a wheelbarrow. It drove the whole of German society mad. And at that stage, there was a possibility of a workers' revolution. Again, an opportunity that was missed. During this period of time, Hitler, Adolf Hitler, a petty bourgeois corporal, a man who was grounded in anti-Semitism, who was deeply anti-Semitic, who'd been around the extreme right in Germany, began to build his organisation. He initially joined the German Workers' Party, then he formed his own organisation, which became the Nazis. And he was a guy who cut his teeth by working for military intelligence, by doing lectures to try to convince soldiers of the dangers of Marxism and so on. It was his anti-Marxism which fed Hitler from the beginning. This is what he said. He said, "I regard it as my task before posterity to destroy Marxism. And that is no empty phrase, but a solemn oath which I shall perform as long as I live." So Hitler was motivated right from the start by a hatred of Marxism. Now, in 1923, there was an abortive attempt by the far right in which Hitler was involved, the Munich Putsch, which failed, didn't get support of the army. Hitler was briefly sent to prison with a slap on the wrist, and so on. But it was quite clear that at that stage, sections of the German ruling class began to look to Hitler's organisation, if not as the first choice, but certainly as an opportunity, given what had happened in Italy. And he began to receive certain amounts of money. I haven't got time to go into where he got it all from. Tyson, for example, coal barons began to put money in. And the Nazis, just like the Italian fascists, attempted to build an organisation which was mass-based, middle-class, based around a vicious anti-Semitism, which they combined with a vicious anti-left-wing spin, which also contained within inside it some vague anti-capitalist rhetoric, which was directed at the left. They, of course, had this crazy view that the Jews controlled big business and they controlled Bolshevism, and that the two were in collusion together. And as I say, Hitler built his base in that way, and he also built his organisation, the equivalent of the black shirts, called the Stormtroopers, the SA. And he built them, as I say, largely amongst the lower middle classes and discontented elements of German society. But again, just as with Italy, the Nazis were largely marginal for much of the 1920s. I mean, in 1928 in the elections, the Nazis got only 2.5% of the vote. They were dwarfed by the mass parties of the left. However, 1929, when the Wall Street crash came, it hit German society like a hammer blow. Unemployment went from 2 million to 6.1 million in 1932. The middle classes were the ones who were squeezed most, because in an economic crisis of that magnitude, on the one hand, the bosses always have the cushion of their immense wealth to carry them through. On the other hand, the workers have, if you like, the cushion of their organisation, their union power, their political organisations and so on. The middle classes were the ones who were squeezed absolutely. And it was to them that Hitler and the Nazis began to look and operate around on a huge scale. As I say, they combined the same type of plebeian appeal against big business, against monopoly capital, with an appeal on the basis of anti-Semitism. Although it has to be said that anti-Semitism was not absolutely central to the Nazis' appeal. I will perhaps later, I'll mention it now. I mean, the reasons given for people joining the Nazi party is, and a survey was done, and I mean this is obviously thanks to the efficiencies of Nazi society. They listed everything. It says here, a survey of members found that 60% had joined, making no reference at all to anti-Semitism, while 4% of the members of the Nazis only expressed disapproval of it. In other words, it wasn't, yes, they attracted anti-Semites, there's no doubt, but what really attracted people to the Nazis was a sense that this economic crisis needed a solution, and the solution had to be found in the Nazis, who, as I say, combined their attacks on big business with attacks on the left and the Jews. And Hitler himself, again, and I'll come on to this, was somebody who, extremely duplicitous. And I know I've not got long. I'll try to sum up on the Nazis by saying this. You see, what Hitler would do, right at the start, the Nazis received funding from white Russians, from aristocrats and so on. But at the same time, they looked to recruit massively amongst the unemployed, the very people who were the victims of the system, which the people who were funding the Nazis were benefiting from. And what Hitler used to do, he used to have two suits. He used to have a rough and ready suit, which he used to wear. He used to keep it in his car with his driver, and he used to wear that when he used to go and speak in the beer halls and in the working class districts to the unemployed. And then when he'd go and meet with the rich and the aristocracy, he had a much better suit. In fact, he had a dress suit that he used to go and he used to fawn and so on and so forth. And they combined that approach all the way through. But the usefulness to the German ruling class of Hitler's organisation was the fact that they had a mass base. The stormtroopers numbered some 400,000. They were used as a battering ram against the working class. And I'll give you in a second what Trotsky had to say about this. But Hitler had this clear understanding that what Trotsky called the human dust who accumulated around the Nazis could be made to feel like an enormously powerful force. This is what he once wrote, Hitler. He said, mass demonstrations must burn into the little man's soul the conviction that though a little worm, he is part of a great dragon. Well, actually tells you everything he thought about his own supporters, that they were little worms. That was how they built their organisation, controlling the streets, dominating German society with their huge parades and so on. Now, Trotsky, at the time, wrote the following about the Nazis, and his words are absolutely correct. He said, the historical function of fascism is to smash the working class, destroy its organisations, and stifle political liberties, where the capitalists find themselves unable to govern and dominate with the help of democratic machinery. In other words, when it comes to the point in a crisis where the ruling class can no longer rely simply on the democratic process to control the working class, they will turn, as they did with Hitler, to an organisation, a mass-based organisation, which can physically smash the organisations of the working class, which is what they did. Now, I'll briefly sum up by saying this. We're not in the 1930s. We are in an economic crisis. There is no indications, as far as we can see at this moment, that the British ruling class, for example, are turning to the British National Party as their salvation. The crisis isn't that deep, and the threat of working class resistance isn't that great. And also the BNP, as we can see, have fallen apart. But it's not true to say that at periods in British history, and I'm concentrating on Britain at the moment, there hasn't been the thought, certainly among sections of the British ruling class, that fascism could pose an alternative. Certainly in the 1930s, though Mosley's organisation was not a mass organisation, it certainly attracted the support of key sections, or some sections, of the British ruling class. And I'll tell you this, I would be able to name them, but for one fact. They are all subject to the Official Secrets Act, right? Which the names of the people who the British state knew would have backed Mosley and a Nazi invasion of Britain is now under lock and key for the next 100 years. So by 2036, and I may or may not be alive then, we'll all be able to have a meeting where we can list these bastards who would have been on the side of the Nazis. But they've never really posed that serious threat in the sense in Britain. However, you do have to say that when you look, for example, at the English Defence League, the English Defence League we describe as a proto-fascist organisation when it first emerged. And I think subsequently, we've quite rightly said it's moved into becoming an openly fascist organisation, very similar in many respects to the Italian fascists. Squads, anti-left squads. I mean, I'm based in Newcastle, where the EDL on 2 occasions have attacked our meetings. They've started to attack left meetings around the country. They combine Islamophobia, which is the new anti-Semitism, with attacks on the left, Trump unions, etc. In Europe, we've seen how even if fascist parties aren't necessarily on the verge of power, what they can do is poison the political atmosphere with their racism and Islamophobia, push established parties to the right and actually create conditions whereby fascist ideas become respectable, racist ideas become respectable, and where in a period of crisis, workers are divided amongst themselves. And I'll just finish, I'll finish by giving what I think is the best description of what fascism is, and it comes from Leon Trotsky, whose writings on Germany I would encourage any comrade who hasn't read them to read. They're, on the one hand, the most insightful and brilliant analysis, and on the other, the most painful things to read, because Trotsky's analysis wasn't just about analysing, but how to stop the Nazis, and had his words and his ideas been put into practice, we would not have seen the Holocaust, and we wouldn't be having a meeting about it today. This is what Trotsky described fascism, he said. He says, everything that should have been eliminated from the national organism in the form of cultural excrements in the course of the normal development of society has now come gushing out from the throats. Capitalist society is puking up the undigested barbarism. Such is the physiology of National Socialism. Fascism, as he described it, is the shit of human society created by capitalism, which it pukes out at key moments. Our task is to ensure that that never ever happens again. I'll come back on a few other things. I mean, first of all, just to the comrade from Ireland, I remember going to doing a series of meetings around Ireland some years ago on the issue of racism, and encountering people who were saying, well, we don't understand, there's no racism in Ireland, etc., etc. And I also encountered people who were talking about how would you combat it. I'll tell you how you combat it. You can tell them this. When my dad came to this country in 1950 from India or Pakistan, when he went round looking for somewhere to live, there used to be posters in the window, which he tells me about, which used to say, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. So anybody who's talking about Irish jobs for Irish workers should remember how that vicious anti-Irish racism was used against Irish workers in this country. So we should remind them of that. A few things. The Nazis in Germany. I thought it was important to concentrate on the historic aspect of it, because obviously the discussion has been about the more contemporary side of it. The thing is, the Nazis could have been stopped. The Nazis weren't this all-powerful organisation. Yes, there were 400,000 stormtroopers, but as Yunus said, the workers' movements had far more supporters. I mean, not just the Reich banner, but the Communist Party had an organisation called the Red Front Fighters, who were out on the streets on a regular basis confronting the Nazis. The problem was the lunatic position taken by the German Communist Party that the real enemy wasn't the Nazis, but was in fact the Social Democrats. Where Trotsky argued for the need for a united front of the workers' organisations to confront the fascists, the leadership of the Communist Party said the real problem is the Social Democrats, and that allowed the Social Democrats to get off the hook in terms of uniting the two groups together to confront the Nazis. But it did happen. There was unity. In the Altona district of Hamburg, the SS attempted to march through. It was a red district. They attempted to march through Altona in 1932. And on this occasion, the workers' organisations of both the Communist Party and the Social Democrats united together. And what was the result? 16 Nazis were killed in a clash between the workers and the SS. Now that could have happened up and down Germany, and they could have stopped the Nazis. But the tragedy is the division that existed, and we cannot afford to repeat that. That is absolutely why it's true that we work, as women said, with people well to our rights, people who do not share our views about a whole series of things but are prepared to stand with us to fight against fascism. On the question of how do we deal with them individually, you see, I think where we do encounter individuals who we can have a debate with, you should try to convince them, show them how ridiculous the arguments are, go through it, explain it. But let's also be clear as well, sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes it doesn't work. And Trotsky had an answer for that. He says, if you can't persuade a fascist, acquaint his head with the papers. Individual here should be acquainting the heads of the EDL with the payments. Yes, it does, but on an individual basis. Because you see, we're not a thug organisation. We hold Marxism to discuss and debate the ideas. Right? We don't organise squads to go out and confront them, because we believe that our set of ideas can transform the world for the millions. And therefore we understand that the necessity always is to build serious mass organisations where we have the power, where we demonstrate that power. And it's interesting, as a number of comrades have said, that the English Defence League came out with the garbage they did about the 30th. I mean, interestingly enough, this organisation starts off saying we're not racist, has on its website, Black and White Unite, we're not racist, we're not even against all Muslims, we're just against ex-Muslim extremists. Then it becomes, we're against Muslims. And now when you read the stuff, it's Pakis. And, as Liam quite rightly pointed out, one of the key leaders of the infidels who split with them to the right, now he's saying that he's read the protocols of the Elders of Zion and he's found it illuminating. The fact that this organisation was set up by BNP supporters with double-barrelled names, bankrolled by a millionaire who supported and has been involved with fascist organisations throughout Europe, tells you where they're going. And when they start coming out as they did, with stuff attacking truck unions, the left, the communists, the strikers, then we get a sense of where they are headed and how they're attempting to turn the people who join them, who don't see themselves initially as fascists, into fascists. And I mean, I was hoping against hope that they were delivered on their promise made by Jackson Lennon, whatever his name is, Tommy Robinson, that piss pot from Luton, that they were going to organise squads to defend the police against the students, because all the students were all middle class, paid for out of daddy's chequebook. I would have loved to sing those bastards. Go down to Parliament Square and deal with some of the students who fought toe to toe with the Met Police. I would love to have seen them do it. And that's why we've got to make sure that when they march on the 9th, wherever they march, we mobilise the largest number of people possible. Because make no doubt about it, we have got to break the back of their organisation. We have got to break the back of it. We've got to make them feel frightened of going on the streets, because they are human dust, as Trotsky said. They are the worms who feel strong when they're in numbers. And it's only when we start to exert our power and show our strength that we can deal with them. Comrades were quite right. When we had our demonstration on March the 26th, when there were 500,000, 750,000 of us, who were the EDL? What are they? They're nothing. Dregs. But when, on an individual scale in a small town or a city, they turn out numbers, they can feel much stronger. But we have always got to remember that there's more of us than there is of them. And we've got to start to mobilise and ensure that we do turn out numbers. Because, Not everybody's up for a scrap. You know, we don't recruit people on the basis of how hard they are. We recruit people on the basis that they believe in transforming society and that we can do it collectively. But we gain our strength and our confidence, all of us, from our ability to mobilise and to build. And when we do that, we gain in confidence and they lose confidence, and we can deal with them. And let's also be clear about this. Yes, it's true that we're not facing an imminent fascist takeover, and it's true that the ruling class haven't thrown the weight behind these organisations. But it's also true that the ruling class are more than adept at playing the race card and creating the conditions where it becomes very difficult for us to organise and much easier for the fascists to organise. That's why Cameron's been coming out with the stuff that he has done, attacking multiculturalism. That's why Merkel came out with it. That's why Sarkozy came out with it, because these people are in trouble. They know it, and they want to turn us against each other. And we've got to make sure that they don't do that. And I'll just finish with this. You see, again, Trotsky defined fascism as a movement of counter-revolutionary despair at a time of economic crisis, to which he said we must contrast socialism as a revolutionary movement of hope. And you know, one of the things that the Nazis did, they attempted to colonise the imagery and the ideas of socialism in order to turn it against us. That's what they did. That's why they had red on their flag. That's why they stole the songs and the tunes from the German workers' movement and turned them against them. Well, I think it's up there for us to turn something against them. Anybody might have seen the film Cabaret, I'm sure many people have. And there's a chilling moment, isn't there? When a little lad gets up and starts singing. And he sings a song, Tomorrow Belongs to Me. People should know this. That song was originally a communist song, and it wasn't Tomorrow Belongs to Me, it was Tomorrow Belongs to Us, and that's our message to the Nazis.